Layla, any news from Boren? Should we give him? Ah, hi there, Boren. Thanks for joining. I think. Hi there. Great. Okay. All right, everyone. We'll give it one more minute to let people join us, and then we'll get started. Okay then, hi there everyone. I'm conscious that we're 2 minutes past the hour, so it's a good time for us to get started, I think. Thank you so much for joining us today from all over the world. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping things for the webinar. So you will find that you have been muted already and your videos are off, just to minimize background noise for our panelists here today. I would ask our panelists to stay on mute unless they're speaking. And again, please do have your videos on when you're speaking, but turn them off otherwise. You can post questions. We actually now have a Q&A function you'll see at the bottom of our screen. We would love to hear from you, love to hear the questions you have, the challenges you're facing in your work. Please do post those in the Q&A function. And anything else you'd like to share, any comments, reflections, tools, please do share those in the chat. Also, just a reminder that the session is being recorded today and will be available on the INEE website along with the presentations. So again, just you can find it there, and please do share with your colleagues as well. And then if we can just move to the next slide. Thanks, Hannah. So thank you so much for joining us today. Today's webinar is focusing on supporting teachers in crisis context during COVID-19. This is the 5th webinar in our series focusing on the impact of coronavirus and support to education in emergencies. As I say, you can find the recordings on our website, and we will be having about one webinar a week for the next few weeks, trying to address these different topics that we're all trying to address in our work currently. And we heard very much that teachers was a real priority for so many of you. I think we know that teachers are integral to the continuity of education always, but particularly at this time. And I think we're also conscious that the decisions we take now about teachers in terms of both our programming and policies will have real implications for education systems in the future. So a really urgent issue for us all today. And before we get started, our colleagues at Teach for All sent us this quote from teachers in Morocco, which I think is a nice reminder about the importance of teachers here. And they said, one thing that became clear to us is that during this period, the work that we are doing is tremendous. It requires all of us to work together. What we are doing is more important now than before. So I'd just like us all to keep that in mind as we go through the presentations today. But before we get started, I will hand over to my wonderful director here at INEE, Dean Brooks, for more of a formal welcome to the webinar. Thanks, Dean.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of INEE's members and guests from around the world. Very excited about today's webinar. As a former teacher, I believe this is critical and an important topic for all of us. Just wanted to mention how for INEE and the minimum standards for education in emergencies, how critical and integral teachers are to the minimum standards, and you'll find more of a focus there when you take a moment to take a look. I also wanted to draw your attention to INEE's very active network space on teachers in crisis contexts, and you'll find information here on the website or here on the webinar about that, but also please visit the website inee.org to learn more about this network space. We have many panelists today who are a part of that. And it's very important work that's taking place. And then just finally, really want to thank Education International and UNESCO's Teacher Task Force for helping us to plan today's webinar and to participate. And we definitely look forward to future collaboration with both entities. So I will hand back to you, Charlotte, but thank you everyone for taking time out during these times to really think about how we might best support teachers.
Thank you so much, Dean. Yeah, really appreciate the welcome and echo the thanks to our colleagues at Education International and the UNESCO Teacher Task Force. It's been great to collaborate with you. If we move to the next slide, Hannah, I'll just give an overview of the agenda for today. So we're going to begin with there's some insights from the recent teacher survey conducted by Education International. Really important work to capture the voices and experience of teachers at this time. So Dennis and Yolo will kindly share the results from that important work. We'll then go into looking at some practical recommendations for teachers in crisis contexts at this time. And Mary Mendenhall joins us from Teachers College, Columbia University, to share some key considerations at this time and some promising practices that are emerging. We'll also hear from our colleagues at War Child UK and War Child Holland, Sarah Hartigan and April Kurtzy, who will talk about adapting programming at this time, which I know it has been a real concern for many of you participating in today's webinar. We'll also hear from Charlotte Berkwin at UNHCR, who's kindly going to share some really important examples from their work in refugee settings across the globe. And lastly, I'm very grateful to be joined from our colleagues at UNRWA, again, to share their reflections of support to teachers at this time. And so thank you to Caroline Pontefract and Frost Abbott for also joining. And then we'll last finish with a look at some global advocacy work around support for teachers, and joined by our colleagues Borin Shakrun and Leila Lupus, who will kindly share a call for action on teachers, which UNESCO Teacher Task Force very rapidly developed and has been a really useful tool for so many of us in advocating for teachers at this time. And then we have protected a good 30 minutes for Q&A with our panelists today, because we know that there are many questions emerging for you in your work at the moment. So thanks again for joining us as participants and as panelists. But I think we should jump right into the agenda, as we have got a lot to get through. So I'm going to hand over to Dennis to kindly share his insights from the recent survey led by Education International. Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you, Charlotte. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues around the world. We would like to first of all thank INEE and our colleagues at UNESCO for supporting this webinar on teachers. For those who may not be familiar with EI or Education International, we are a global federation of education unions representing over 32.5 million teachers and education support personnel or staff from early childhood to university. We have a presence in 179 countries through our 400 affiliates. We are faced with a crisis, colleagues. The crisis that we face is not just a COVID-19 crisis, it is also an education crisis. It's also potentially an economic crisis. In other words, we're faced with triple crises of COVID-19, basically health crisis, education, and the economy. How do governments respond to this? How do we respond to this? What is the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on education? Was the primary purpose of a quick survey that we carried out in mid-March. So we basically wanted to understand what was happening in our schools and other education institutions and what impact this was having on teachers and students' learning. So in this survey, I would like to focus specifically on teacher-related issues from the survey, because this is the purpose of the webinar. Next slide, please. Yes, as I've already pointed out, with 1.6 billion students out of school, this is a real crisis. We need to do something about it. So our survey looked at, as we have indicated, a rapid assessment of what's going on around the world. We wanted to hear from our member organizations how teachers and education support professionals and students were being affected. And we got responses from 103 EI member organizations. This is quite significant because it's about a quarter of our membership, and looking at their individual members, that's about 50%. Next slide. Now, these are the key teacher-related findings. So first of all, it was clear from all our affiliates, all the respondents, that teachers are required to teach online, but there was no preparation whatsoever. And quite many of the teachers do not have the necessary tools, support, sometimes even skills actually, to teach through distance education or e-learning. So that's a big gap from our analysis of the data that we received. And then the second major challenge from our affiliates was that teachers and their unions are not collaborating far enough and not learning from each other. So they need greater collaboration. They need greater learning and sharing of experiences and tools in terms of providing distance education, online learning. As you can see from the first point, this is related in the sense that people needed more understanding, more sharing of knowledge and experiences to try and help students during this crisis. And then the third major challenge was that teachers and education support personnel are actually not consulted when governments make decisions about what tools to use, what methodologies to use, including whether it's the tools that are available to parents with children and so on. Those decisions do not accommodate the views of teachers who understand the situation obviously better, because they are found in every corner of the globe and they are found in every classroom. So they live the experiences of children and communities, and their views are paramount. Unfortunately, they've not been taken into account in coming up with responses. And then the fourth major challenge is that in countries where teachers continue to teach virtually, the workload has increased. This is a bit surprising perhaps to you. Yes, it's true. That's what they're telling us. And then there are security issues. You're probably aware of what happened in Singapore, where a teacher was teaching and then the lesson was hacked, and then the hackers started showing inappropriate images to young children who were following the lesson. And the government had to stop the program. So there are serious security issues as well. And then the fifth major challenge was that of teachers themselves needing support to cope with the challenges that they face, whether it's trauma, whether it's losing a loved one or losing a student or losing a colleague. So they need that support. And then they need training to actually be able to provide necessary support to their students. And then the sixth very concerning finding is that actually some teachers are losing their jobs. Some teachers have gone for weeks, sometimes months without pay. This particularly pertains to contract teachers, those who are hired on short or fixed term or short-term contracts across the different levels of education. The supply teachers, teachers in private schools, and education support professionals. This is a serious issue. You are probably aware of one of the big privatizers in the world, Bridge, who are reported in Kenya to have actually decided to either reduce drastically the salaries of teachers or not pay them at all. Next slide, please. Now, having given you this flavor of the findings, this is not all. I just selected a few because of the time constraints. The report itself will have details and we hope to launch it in the next few days. So we would like to share with you a few recommendations. So first of all, when governments make decisions concerning a response to COVID-19 in education, especially now that some countries are beginning to reopen schools, they should take the students' and educators' health, safety, and well-being into account. That should be the #1 priority. That means providing the necessary personal protective equipment, providing the necessary support, both physical as well as mental support. So psychosocial support is paramount. How do we do that? Yes, it would mean engaging experts in some instances, but also empowering teachers themselves to support colleagues and their students. And then #2, governments and partners should engage with educators through their unions, of course, in coming up with relevant, effective, and proportionate measures to respond to COVID-19. There is no way, as I said earlier on, that governments can come up with an effective response if they do not consult teachers. For it to be relevant, to get the support of teachers, they must be involved through their unions. So teachers are part of the solution. And then governments should also ensure full funding, especially now that we're looking at recovery. We are facing a potential economic crisis, and if there is a crisis, a financial crisis, an economic crisis, unfortunately, education tends to be one of those sectors that suffer. So it's important that we protect education, that we protect our teachers, our education support professionals, so that they can go back and teach those who have been dismissed, that they can continue to support their students. And of course, that also means giving them all the necessary training so that they can deliver education, even now. So those who need ICT training, distance education training, need support now. And then fourth, governments should ensure the protection of teachers and education support personnel's terms and working conditions. No teacher, no education support staff should be dismissed or denied their salary or working conditions as a result of COVID-19. EI has come up with 12 guiding principles which we encourage governments and partners to look at. And these guiding principles clearly identify a number of issues and areas that should be taken into account when responding to COVID-19. And we will soon be releasing another set of principles which governments and partners should take into account when reopening schools, of course, alongside our affiliates. Last slide. Next slide, please. I just want to leave you with this thought. This thought is inspired by what I saw from the various responses of the EI member organizations, the teachers, the teacher leaders around the world. Educators and their unions are frontline workers. So when we think about frontline workers, let's not forget about them. They need the same attention, same consideration as any other frontline workers. And they're doing the very best to support their students during these crises. They deserve every government and every partner's support to help every child, youth, and adult enjoy the right to free, quality public education during and after the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Really powerful words there to finish the presentation. Thank you so much, and really important and interesting findings, and just really important to be elevating teachers' voices at this time. So we thank you so much for that. We're now going to turn to think about what does that mean in practice then for us in our work. And we're going to start by turning to Mary Mendenhall. Many of you will know Mary's work to support teachers in crisis contexts, both across academia and also in practice and implementation. And Mary's going to share some reflections around key considerations at this time and promising practices. So thanks, Mary, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you for organizing today's webinar. I think we all agree it's incredibly important to increase the focus and attention on teachers. And so several of my comments, I think, will complement the findings that Dennis just shared from the EI survey. But I also hope to zero in a little bit on the what might be different about the various profiles of teachers who were working in crisis-affected or conflict-affected contexts before the onset of the coronavirus. So we might think about refugee teachers, internally displaced teachers, local teachers who are working in conflict-affected settings, and national teachers hosting refugee learners are just some examples of the different profiles we might find in an education and emergencies context. And so now these teachers have to deal with the additional complications presented by the COVID-19 pandemic. So I don't have time to differentiate across all the different profiles, but I did want to raise a few key considerations and some promising practices that I'm learning about in this process. So first, teachers are often forgotten as a key stakeholder group in education and emergencies contexts. They aren't always represented in education working groups or education cluster meetings. But we know it's critical to include them in policy and practice related decisions, because as Dennis mentioned, they are on the front lines in the education sector, and the decisions that we make around those tables and are now in these virtual spaces will either fail or succeed depending on how closely we work with teachers. I think it's also important to remember that teachers are natural leaders in their communities. Community members will look to trusted teachers for guidance, whether it's about health and hygiene practices, protection issues, or the safe return to school. So teachers play a valuable role in helping inform the community about what is going on. The second point is that teachers who are working in EiE contexts pre-pandemic were already in vulnerable positions in terms of job security, adequate compensation, and predictable payments. So it's imperative, as I think we're going to hear several times in today's presentation or today's webinar, it's imperative to continue paying teachers their salaries during the disruption caused by the coronavirus. I was encouraged to hear actually a number of EiE actors who are currently working in Uganda, that they have come together and prepared a joint advocacy statement that they've then passed on to the donors funding the various projects happening there. And in that statement, they have included a very clear justification for why they need to continue paying teachers. And so they were able to articulate how important it is to keep teachers on the payroll and to ensure a return to school and continuity of instruction when schools reopen. So, a kind of a tangible thing that different actors can do, whether it's governmental actors, NGO actors, community-based organizations, to come together as they think about who's funding what's happening in the education sector to ensure that teacher payments and teacher job security continue despite the crisis. So third, current practices are improving in this regard, but still too often teachers are overlooked in discussions about psychosocial support and social emotional learning. And once again, we are asking teachers to take on more work. We heard that in the survey results from Dennis. And they're doing that just because of the workload in and of itself, but also because they are obvious leaders in their communities, or because they will play a very pivotal role when schools reopen and they prepare to welcome back students who have either experienced adverse conditions because of the coronavirus and what that impact felt like for their family, or because there was an increase in abuse or violence in some families while they were at home. So we need to extend psychosocial support to teachers now and in the return to school. And this might entail simple steps of calling them on the phone to check in on a regular basis. So different supervising organizations can do this. Sending occasional text messages, reassuring them about their jobs and their compensation, and also asking them about new and emerging needs that they see or anticipate in the school setting when schools do reopen. So fourth, we know that teachers working in EiE contexts often receive short, sporadic, and even low quality training and professional development that is insufficient for helping them, and by extension their learners, overcome the challenges brought on by any crisis. So as different schools and systems and organizations think about how to support teachers now and in the return to school, we know that they'll need more support to help learners who have experienced abuse or violence and disrupted education in and of itself. So depending on how long students have been out of school, teachers will need help providing remedial or catch-up instruction. And we cannot assume that these are easy things for teachers to know and to do. And we need to plan as well in advance as possible based on the needs in different places. So on to the next slide, point 5. The vast majority of technological innovations in the education emergencies field focus on learners and oftentimes attempt to replace teachers' critical roles in teaching and providing psychosocial support to learners and much more. So we can leverage technology to support teachers, whether it's SMS or WhatsApp messages or online communities of practice. We can find ways to reach teachers, to provide continued professional development, to disseminate key messages, and help teachers connect with one another as they navigate the new territory of homeschooling, distance learning, or returning to school after a health pandemic. And I know I'm running out of time here, so 2 really quick points. I think from my perspective, if there's any silver lining to this crisis, I'm sure that we've all noticed the increased kind of recognition and accolades being offered to teachers, especially those of us struggling to help our own children continue to learn, whether we're juggling other work or not. It's no easy feat. So we need to leverage this newfound realization of how hard it is to be a teacher, that not everyone can do this job and do it well, and advocate for better working conditions, quality professional development, fair compensation, and ongoing support to teachers, both in EIE contexts and around the world. And finally, point 7, we have to capture everything we are learning and write more robust preparedness plans that include the critical and multifaceted role of teachers in any crisis, including health pandemics. So let me stop there for now, and happy to answer questions later in the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. Really powerful and practical ways in which we can take these things forward in our work, all such important considerations. So thank you so much for sharing these with us. And I'm excited for the following panelists to also demonstrate how these can be done in their work. So I'm going to hand over to our colleagues at War Child, who I know are going to touch on some of these points around how we can be working with and for teachers at this time in terms of how we're sort of rapidly adapting programming. So handing over to Sarah and April. Thank you both for joining us.
Hi there, everyone. I'm Sarah. As Charlotte introduced me, I work at War Child UK. I'm the Education and Emergencies Advisor. So what we wanted to do is just try and give a bit of a flavour of how we've been adapting programming and putting teachers central to our planning for the COVID response. So as Charlotte said, we'll be doing a bit of tag team between War Child UK, myself, and War Child Holland, April. So whilst we began thinking about our COVID response, we wanted to put teachers quite central to our considerations, recognising that school closures have been some of the first responses by local governments, often ahead of social distancing measures, and also recognising that these issues will compound some of the problems that are already facing the teaching workforce. So thinking about things such as non-payment of staff and the potential for increased teacher attrition rates. So just to kind of jump straight into some of the examples of how we've developed and changed our work for this response. With students unable to attend classes in DRC, we've seen local governments considering radio lessons and other media sources, which some students are able to access, others less likely to be able to access. So for students that are able to access these media sources, we thought it was important that students should be engaged and it should be a two-way learning, and for that process, teachers have to be central to the planning. So to ensure interactive learning, we have used our experience over the past 6 years having child protection helplines and adapted that process for education helplines staffed by teachers, either to feed into radio shows so that students frequently asked questions are able to be answered, but also for the potential for students to ask teachers curriculum-based questions. So for that, we will be developing a training pack around how best to provide student support within this space, as it's something that's quite new and it's something that they may not be already doing. So just to kind of, I recognise I'm glossing over this, but I'm very aware of time and sharing it appropriately. So moving on, one of the other programs that we were developing was supporting teachers in Iraq through the use of messaging platforms such as WhatsApp. So one of the considerations that we had to think very carefully about was safeguarding, but also our teacher well-being, recognising that messaging platforms such as this can be quite overwhelming, potentially in this situation, but also with many students wanting to request information from teachers, and they could be doing this at any time of the day. So we will use the platforms in two ways. So one for student-teacher communications, but secondly for teacher support groups. So to counteract any safeguarding issues, each student-teacher group will cover one school class and will include 2 teachers, A, so they can support each other, but B, so that we've got a safeguarding measure in place as well. there's stringent safeguarding guidance, including obtaining parent caregiver consent and providing key messaging. But alongside this, we have really, really strict rules for our teachers to protect them in terms of ring fencing their time. So, for example, they have specific working hours. Parents and students have been communicated what those will be so that they cannot be contacted outside of those hours. It will be using war child phones so that, again, it's only communicated through non-personal phone numbers, and that these should be turned off outside of working hours so that teachers are not overwhelmed by the amount of communication that they might be receiving. So then, as part of our second group, to ensure that teachers are supported, they will be given training guidance documents that support them in teaching students in this way and supporting students in this way. With that guidance, there are also wellbeing and safeguarding tips to help them deal with this new way of informing students and engaging with students. So one of the final additional points just before I hand over to April is that we are also setting up, led by our education officers, peer-to-peer support WhatsApp groups so that teachers can troubleshoot any problems they're having with this new way of working, but also so that they can support each other with some of the challenges that come alongside that for their own well-being. So this kind of leads quite nicely into April's presentation, where she'll be telling us about some teacher wellbeing mechanisms that War Child Holland have set up.
Thanks, Sarah. Hannah, can we have the next slide? Please, great, thank you. Oh, half of it's missing. Okay, not to worry. Hello, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, and evening. Thank you for allowing me to present on this. I think has been clear from all the presentations before that there is going to be a great need. There was before, there is now, and there will continue to be a great need to support teacher well-being. As Dennis commented, the workload for teachers has gone up. I know even teachers I've been discussing in the UK have had years of experience of finding it stressful, and they have anxiety over using different technology or the expectations, job security in the context where we work. All of those things increase the need for teachers to have some sort of support mechanism now, but also as we move in to the next phase post-corona. You know, we're not quite sure what the new normal in terms of education might be, and there will be increased stress on teachers to be able to handle that. So within War Child Holland, we've been working for a long time on a teacher wellbeing program, which we've been testing, and we're going to look at effectiveness studies on that, hopefully, as we go forward. And as part of that, we had developed this 10-hour workshop-based wellbeing intervention, which we're trying to look at the moment and discussing about whether that might be something that we can adapt to reach teachers. So the wellbeing, just to give a bit of a background on it, it's based on acceptance and commitment therapy. And we are taking wellbeing, our definition of wellbeing, not just as an absence of distress or negative emotions or problems, but looking at more also how do you have a positive satisfaction with life, how do you have fulfillment, coping, and positive functioning. And so for us, that's why we have framed it around acceptance and commitment therapy, because we're not just looking at introducing activities such as mindfulness activities and being able to watch your thoughts and not being so caught up in your emotions and thoughts, and being able to accept difficult feelings, but also to identify what is your value system. So what type of teacher do you want to be? What type of parent, friend, husband, wife? So what is your value system? And then how can you take that emotional space that you have and your value system and being able to move forward to be able to action on that value system? So that is the principle behind the intervention. And we want to look at it in two ways, and the slide's not there for the digital. But we were very aware that on the one hand, we wanted to look at how can we use digital medium to be able to do this Oh, there we go. That's better. But also then to look at non-digital. So that's why I'm going to look at the 2 lines first of all, because I think we're all very aware that there's been quite a focus on digital, but there's also a big group of teachers and children that don't have access to the internet, that don't have access to even phone data. So what can we do with that? We also feel, so this process will take a little time, because we also feel that post-corona, it may be that we have quite intense social distancing enforcement that comes in for a while, and that teachers may not be able to come together in the way that we might have originally planned. So could we still also use this going forward? So the first thing is to look at we already have the methodology. So can we adapt this, just low key, not massively adapt it, but look at things like handout and activities and group activities. How do we adapt this to be able to do it online? Then we'd like to test it with a group of teachers, preferably English speaking teachers. So we're looking at possibly Uganda or Jordan, or if anyone else has any countries and they'd like to be involved, please don't hesitate to contact me. So we can test this out and identify from the teachers during the workshop, how was it? Was it useful? Was it user-friendly? What were the parts of the workshop that they felt were the most relevant to them? So we can prioritize those as elements and be able to mitigate some of the challenges that may be around using this kind of format. And then of course some online training for within War Child. We already have facilitators that work on mental health and psychosocial support, so training them to deliver the content. But then at the same time, we want to look at how we might be able to do this with non-digital. And with War Child UK, also looking at the leverage of what they're doing and seeing can we work somehow together. So first of all, we wanted to look at gathering some information on how do teachers want to receive information? What is the easiest way for them to receive information? How can we access them? How often would they be able to be contacted? And then finally look at ways of doing that, took that information and the key priorities and put them together. And I see Charlotte's there, so that means my time is up. So yeah, that's there. And if anybody would like any more information, please just contact me. Thanks, Charlotte. I'm going.
No, thank you, April. It's such important work. So sorry to cut you off. And I have seen a few questions around this sort of non-digital approach. So perhaps we could come to that, back to you for that in the Q&A, if that's okay.
No, thank you.
Thanks, April. We're now going to hand over to UNHCR, and thanks to our War Child colleagues for those great examples of their thinking. And let's now hear from UNHCR about some really a range of examples from different contexts about their work with teachers. So thank you, Charlotte. Over to you.
Thanks, Charlotte. Hi, everybody. My name is Charlotte Berquin, and I'm working for UNHCR as Education Officer for the Regional Bureau for West and Central Africa, based in Senegal and covering 21 countries in the region. I will quickly introduce you to what UNHCR has been doing so far to support teachers in responding to COVID-19, and I'll try to give you very concrete examples of our action. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as Mary mentioned also earlier, our #1 priority upon school closures has been to ensure continuity of payment of teachers' salaries when paid by UNHCR. This approach ensures not only that teachers not lose their livelihood, but also that we do not end up facing a shortage of teachers when the schools reopen because they have left to look for another job. This also makes it possible to engage teachers in the organization of educational continuity. That's, for example, the case in refugee camps in Burkina Faso, even where schools were closed before the COVID situation due to growing insecurity, but also in Chad, Guinea, Liberia, and Mauritania, where both national and refugee teachers are paid by UNHCR. In Somalia, where teachers are paid through school fees, UNHCR also continues to pay school fees to support these teacher costs. Then in refugee settings, UNHCR is trying to engage and support refugee teachers to ensure continuity of education, aligned with national response and while respecting health prevention measures. For example, in refugee camps in Eastern Chad, teachers are organized by district to provide students with home exercises corrected each week. In Liberia, UNHCR is working with both refugee and Liberian teachers in the 3 refugee camps to develop a work plan to support students continuing to study their curriculum. A computer lab will also be set up in the camps so that teachers can have access to online resources to prepare lessons for refugee learners. Another example in Uganda, where UNHCR organized last year a teacher training program on the use of online learning materials through the Colibri platform. These teachers have become champion teachers, and since the shutdown of schools, they have been sharing guidance on how to make use of this platform through WhatsApp groups for teachers. And several teachers who benefited from this training have also appeared on national TV programs to train and guide other teachers on the use of online learning materials. Another area of support is through the development of learning cycles to share educational content and COVID critical messaging. For example, in Kenya, especially in Kakuma camp, an education WhatsApp communication tree was activated following the closure of schools, aiming at sharing health and education information to teachers and learners. This WhatsApp communication network is playing an important role in supporting two-way communication, but also learning continuity for children, teacher training, and mentorship. WhatsApp group for teachers have also been established in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Sri Lanka to inform and share information amongst teachers and to provide content to students. Finally, UNHCR also intends to support teacher professional development on instructional design. In Jordan, for example, UNHCR and the Connected Learning in Crisis Consortium, CLCC, collaborate with the Ministry of Higher Education on instructional design for e-learning by organizing webinars for university professors on different topics. Next slide, please. So another important part of the support we need to provide to teachers will be during the back to school phase. And depending on the duration of classes interruption, teachers will need contextualized training on safe school practices, especially with regards to psychosocial support and health prevention. This goes hand in hand with the strengthening of WASH infrastructure in schools, on which UNHCR also intervenes in different countries. For example, with the support of ECW COVID dedicated funding in many of West African countries. Teacher training to prevent school dropout is also very important because children will return to classrooms having missing months of school with very different degrees of exposure to learning content during this time, and they will thus need dedicated and differentiated support such as accelerated catch-up and remedial programs. I'll finish very quickly. It is also an opportunity to ensure sustainable support to connected education by advocating for investments in digital public infrastructure and support teachers with digital literacy programs and reuse of distance learning materials. And finally, UNHCR is working with different partners, but especially with UNICEF and UNESCO, both at regional and global level, to advocate with ministries of education for the need to develop risk-informed teacher policy documents with systematic inclusion of preparedness measures and continued learning opportunities for all crisis-affected children. Okay, I'll stop here and I'll be happy to answer questions afterwards, if any. Some UNHCR resources on the COVID-19 response will also be shared with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And yes, we'll be sharing the slides after the webinar. Please don't worry, we'll receive those. And I think it's reassuring to hear, I think there's common threads across these presentations that hopefully will help us all move some of these such important points forward. And thanks for taking us around so many different locations where this work is happening, Charlotte. I'm now going to turn to our colleagues at UNRWA who have such extensive experience of supporting teachers in EiE. I know we've have a lot to learn from all of your work in that regard, but also in providing distance learning as well. And so I'm handing over now to Caroline and Frost to share some of their reflections and the work they've been doing with teachers at this time. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, thank you. Now, this very difficult technological issue of how to put my camera on and speak to you while managing to read the slides. So let me try and work that out. There I am, okay. It's all to do with wearing glasses or not. Okay, so I'm too vain to wear the glasses. Okay, I just want to say thank you very much for inviting us onto this. We're very happy to be here. We'll talk very quickly and go through our slides. For those of you who don't know what UNRWA is, even though I'm sure that many of you do, I mean, UNRWA was born of conflict, you know, a different type of conflict we're more used to, which is a conflict in terms of, crisis in terms of conflict. So we're very used to operating in conflicts. We've operated over the years, as they're born of conflict in 1948 with the Palestinians fleeing to the various countries. Then we had, you know, intifadas, we've had wars between the Arab countries, we've had the Lebanon civil war, then we've had Gaza wars, and we've had the Syria war for the last 11 years. So very adept, actually, we've become at education and emergencies with regard to conflict. Obviously, our raison d'etre has to be to continue to provide quality, inclusive education throughout. You know, we had to find a way of doing that, which Frost is going to talk more about. We are responsible for 533,000 children who were expecting to be in school for the whole of March and the whole of April and May too. So they were halfway through the second semester when they all closed. So we've never ever had that before. We've had different disruptions in different fields, but to have closure of all our schools, all our vocational training colleges with about 8,000 young people, all our offices, all our field offices, all the education support staff, this was a kind of pretty unknown scenario. One thing I want to add before we go on is with regard to, we follow the host country curriculum and their study plans and the academic calendar. So that kind of gives us a framework to work within with regard to, you know, any decisions that are made about the schools closing, the schools opening, whether or not there's exams at the end of the year, and catch up. You know, in terms of that, we have that overall framework, even though we operate kind of autonomously within that. Thank you. The next slide, please. Thank you. So what I wanted to say here was teachers were and are very important to UNRWA, and we've recognized the central role of teachers right from the beginning. I've been here far too long now. For 10 years, and we really emphasized from the beginning the importance of teachers, and I think this has stood us in good stead, you know, with regard to how we could call upon them and build upon the kind of strong teaching force for this crisis. So we did have a teacher policy which was endorsed back in 2013, but it took a long time to develop. But it really does look at those issues, you know, of teacher management. It looked at career progression, it looked at professional development, and it looked at support structures. You know, and of course, we actually are drawing down on many of those things now with regard to, say, support structures, the roles of the support structures in supporting remote learning for children, whatever modality is being delivered in. And perhaps our teachers being more motivated because they're part of something as well, and then there is a management system for them. But just to quickly go on to say that you know, it's really important for us always to emphasize the role of the teacher, and within a resource constrained environment, you know, if you put your money anywhere, you put it into your teachers, you know. But our teachers, in terms of the professional development, one thing I think which is very important and worth reflecting on, and maybe people aren't reflecting on it themselves, is our teachers, a lot of our professional development was through self-study. I mean, it was this was our approach, was self-study. So even though the teachers got the chance to go into the classrooms and reflect, etc., and talk to each other, I think it was all, you know, it was through self-study. So they have this awareness, you know, in terms of self-study, in terms of the way it may be written, the kind of way it may be broken up with, you know, self-assessment, with kind of some formative assessment. So they have this experience, and we really want to make sure that the teachers are reflecting on this, that they're not just, you know, kind of working with the children, developing helping them work through the materials, but they are reflecting on this, and we really want to work on this to make it more explicit. So they're thinking about what was good when you were self-studying and what wasn't so good, you know, and how can we actually put that into what we do, you know, with the children, you know, and the encouragement of the community to practice, which was one very, very strong, you know, a real successful part of the distance learning programs that we did for teachers. So I think as a starting point, we wanted to say that we have been emphasising teachers, we have been emphasising their own professional development and having a support structure around them and this idea of career progression. But a key issue that came up before we go on to the actual substance of what we've been doing for COVID-19 is that because of having no money, UNRWA has an increasing amount of daily paid teachers. And therefore, every year when we need more teachers, when we do our exercise that needs more teachers, we replace them with daily paid. So daily paid is obviously only for 9 months, etc. So this has been a huge issue with regard to the program and what we've been doing now, about whether the daily paid teachers are part of this or whether they're not doing anything. And I'll come back to this when we talk more specifically about our COVID-19 response. So over to Frost now, who's going to basically talk about, after the emphasis on teachers, the kind of work that we did already with regard to our education and emergencies response. Thanks, Frost.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, INEE, for organizing this panel. If we can go to the next slide, please. Well, as Caroline noted, my intervention would be more to take you through the UNRWA Education and Emergency program and how we managed to reconceptualize and adapt it in response to the COVID-19. Of course, teachers are central to this education emergency approach, and this is something that Caroline will be talking about in the next slide. And just to highlight that teachers for UNRWA are around almost 22,000 Palestine refugee teachers that we have working across the different 5 fields in which we work. So in terms of the elements of the education and emergency response, continuity of learning is number 1, as education was disrupted through the various conflicts that UNRWA faced throughout the years. We had to come up with what we call the self-learning program. And this is a program that is run through UNRWA TV, educational lessons, through an interactive learning platform, and through education material in print. Of course, there were also guidelines for parents and teachers on how to use the self-learning program. With the COVID-19, we had to look, and we saw that the students in all 5 fields, they have their textbooks. And so the material we had to develop was more in terms of wraparound material around the textbooks. And we had to look on different ways of delivering this material to the students, because in conflict times, we used to deliver self-learning programs in alternative safe spaces. Now with the limitations of social distancing, this cannot happen. The other element of our education and emergency response is psychosocial support. And previously this was and is still emphasized through the role that counselors play. We also emphasize recreational activities and working with partners when it comes to referrals. With the COVID-19 and the opportunity of having recreational games or recreational activities, we had to think how we deliver psychosocial support. And so our counselors are delivering sessions through, for example, online platforms. We are looking into integrating psychosocial messaging within our self-learning materials. And we are exchanging across the different 5 field offices on recreational games that could be delivered somehow through support, through online or remote support. Safety and security was another key element of our education and emergency response. And previously, given the context that we operate in, we were talking about school evacuation plans. We were talking about evacuation drills and safety and security trainings for teachers. Now we have to look more into health messaging and staying safe health-wise. TIVET is also another area in which we're prioritizing. And last but not least, I'm wary of time, is the monitoring and evaluation element, which we are also emphasizing throughout this response.
Okay.
The next slide.
Yeah, please. Sorry, next slide, please. Okay, the one but last slide. Okay. Just to say, with regard to the teacher's role, now I heard colleagues say earlier that the teachers need to be involved. I think they certainly need to be prepared. And we're already talking now about, like, what are we going to spend the summer doing? Because our schools close in the next month. But that we must learn from this. And I think a colleague from UNHCR said that too. We've got to learn from this and we've got to build on it. So even if there's no COVID from tomorrow onwards, we've got to make sure that our teachers and our system is prepared. And so we've got to think about, you know, reflecting, we've got to reflect, we've got to get the teachers to reflect, they've got to be involved, they've got to understand their role, but they can't all develop worksheets. We need to get that right, that balance between engaging them and not kind of having parents and students kind of overwhelmed, which we did have in one field at one time when everyone's sending things out and psychosocial messages and self-learning worksheets. So it's got to be managed. That's very important, which we haven't really talked about much before. It's got to be managed, because we've got this strong support system in place at the moment with every field, with a strong professional support system that we've been working with the last few years. We are working together to try to put a process in place which will support those teachers so that they do understand their role. They have self-studied, as I said. They do understand how to support a student. They are connected by WhatsApp. I think someone else mentioned that, how important it is that they talk to each other. They are aware of how to assess students. Now, a lot we've got all in place, but a lot to think about. But as I said, to manage them, not just think teachers need to be prepared, they need to kind of do it. That's the kind of very idealistic view, I think. It needs to be a system that supports them. Very important, their role in monitoring and evaluation as well. Finding out for us about children's accessibility. Do they really have access to a mobile phone even? If so, is it for 10 minutes a day if it belongs to their mother? You know, how are they finding it? What are parents' perceptions? Are parents overwhelmed by this new responsibility? So in terms of accessibility, and we're developing core questions for all our 5 fields to look at what's actually happening with regard to accessibility, and then in terms of how the children are finding the learning, and then of course eventually onto the actual outcomes and the teacher support. So we monitor and evaluate that. What did they think? You know, how were they supported? And with regard to the teacher's own psychosocial well-being, I think that was mentioned by several colleagues, that there's a lot going on which is not our responsibility as such, I mean, i.e. that someone else is doing it, with regard to the self-care for the teachers, so that they can think about supporting their children psychosocially. So as I see that Charlotte is there, ever present, I will kind of end, because I just want to say the most important thing is building the system now, you know, getting it right, learning the lessons, getting it down, you know, archiving it, institutionalizing it, so we have this memory of what we've done and how it's evolved and what we found out and how we changed, and that we should work together as agencies, that we don't have, and I said this in another webinar, is that we don't have brilliant things coming out from INEE and brilliant things coming out from UNESCO and brilliant things. We work together, because otherwise we're doing the same to all our stakeholders there, all of us, that we're saying that teachers shouldn't do to children. We're sending out loads of things. This is how you develop distance. This is what you do for this. This is what you do for this. And I know, because we're trying to keep track of it, it's kind of overwhelming. So I think that we should also work as a system. So that will be one last plea for us to work as a system to see how we can work together with regard to guiding all of us, each other, on how we can actually support children's learning and obviously teachers. Thank you, Charlotte. You were very good that you stood there nicely.
Sorry, I'm so sorry, Caroline.
Didn't start waving a red flag. Oh, I didn't even have my.
Sorry to cut you off.
Sorry,
we only have Boren.
No, I know. I didn't have my video on.
No. It's such important information. But Boren, I hope you're still with us. I'm hoping we can take 5 minutes of your time.
Yeah, sorry about
if you are still there.
Here, I will have to leave in a few minutes, but I'm here.
Great, thank you, Boren. Apologies for the delay, and thank you for joining us. We'll hand over to you now. So really great to hear your reflections. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and good afternoon, good morning to all colleagues. I'm very pleased to be with you today, and I would like to share with you a few points related to the call for action that the TTF launched very quickly, because we were aware that there is a major challenge for teachers in this context of the COVID-19 education response. And we have seen also that there is less attention to their own well-being and protecting their jobs and protecting their revenues. In a way, we put forward, and maybe we can move to the next slide. First of all, I think it's important to speak about the scale. Of course, there were, and I think Dennis referred to the number of learners who are affected in countries, but we tend to forget that there are more than 63 million teachers that are affected, and some of the teachers are not under the radar. And I think I would like to thank INEE for organizing this event, because some of the teachers that are operating in the conditions of displaced, for targeting displaced person, targeting other refugees and migrants. Probably they are not in the 63 million that we are counting here, and they are not under the radar. Earlier, the colleagues at UNRWA mentioned the TVET and Technical and Vocational Education and Training, but obviously also teachers who are delivering adult learning programs, who are delivering literacy programs, and in pre-primary as well. They are not under the radar. So we need to think about teachers in a lifelong learning perspective in different contexts, including non-formal and informal, and including the context that we are referring to here today in this meeting. But there is a scale, and the scale is more than 60 million teachers which are affected by the situation as well, and we need to keep this in mind. Next, please. So we organized a discussion with our members in the teacher task force, and we came out with 3 key areas that we thought important for attracting the attention of the policymakers, but also for other stakeholders, civil society, social partners, and the international community. The first one is about preserving employment and wages. And you know very well that in many countries, in many contexts, teachers now are out of employment. They're not having their revenues, and potentially, while we are moving out of the crisis, meaning getting back to school, there is a situation where the budget of allocated to education may shrink. There is a risk. We hope not, and our role is to advocate for that. But if there are risks, then of course teachers are the ones that probably will suffer from this situation, and it's important to preserve their status, their employment, and their wages in this context. We also think that it's important to protect their health, safety, and well-being. We are speaking now to returning to school, and obviously there is a concern both for learners but also for teachers. During the distance learning and continuity of learning, we thought that it's important also to attract attention to the teachers' safety and well-being and socio-emotional support that has to be provided to them. We think that it's important to include teachers in any response related to the COVID-19 education response here. I mean, particularly that there is a lot of attention to online learning, online platform. And as one of the colleagues was referring to, first we see that in many countries it's a mix of solutions. And in many countries it's rather low-tech solution that is adopted, meaning radio, TV, and other type of delivery, and not necessarily high-tech solutions that are adopted. So it's important to understand that teachers play an important role, and that the education response has to take into consideration the voice and the contribution of teachers in this context. Next, please. We continue pushing for developing the capacities and professional training and professional support to teachers, including in the context of the crisis, and probably as we move out of the crisis. Dennis earlier mentioned that many teachers were put into online platform without prior training and learning opportunities. We know from the surveys that many teachers are lacking digital skills, and that's one of the barriers that can prevent them from engaging effectively and in the way they would like to have with the online teaching and with the different options that are offered today, and into which sometimes they are asked to join without prior training and capacity development. Equity, from our point of view, should remain at the heart of any education response. Equity related to learners, but also equity related to teachers, because we know that the crisis might exacerbate the situation of teachers, particularly in remote areas, in low-income countries, or in minority communities, and obviously contract teachers, for example, as one of the target group that might be affected. Last and not least is the teachers in aid responses. We think that if there will be any support from the international community, support to teachers, the role of teachers has to be placed at the highest in the agenda, and there should be attention to that. Let me finish with the last slide, if you don't mind, to mention that we have launched at UNESCO the Global Education Coalition, which is mobilizing multi-stakeholders collaboration around responding to the COVID-19 crisis, which involves different stakeholders, UN agencies, civil society, non-profit organizations, technology companies, development banks, and others. And this global coalition has as an objective and goal to respond to the challenges for continuing learning and for equity in this context. So, and the TTF is part of the global coalition, as well as Education International, ILO, VVOB, and other colleagues who joined it, and INEE, of course, who joined the global coalition. Thank you very much, and I wish you a good discussion afterwards, and I'm sorry to leave you. And my colleague Leila will remain, and she will be happy to address the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Boran, and thank you for letting us take 5 minutes extra of your time. We really appreciate it, and appreciate those reflections and the important global advocacy work that you and colleagues at UNESCO Teacher Task Force are doing for teachers. So thank you so much. Wonderful. So thank you to all our panelists. I think we've heard some really fascinating, varied and very practical insights into the needs of teachers at this time, and the work we can all be doing together. And just recognizing Caroline's point that the more we do together, the more we collaborate and harmonize our efforts, the more effective we'll be, particularly in these resource limited times. So we now have 30 minutes for discussion with our wonderful panelists, and we've had some great questions that have been coming in during the Q&A, so thank you for sharing those. I'm going to ask our panelists to now all come back onto the video so that we can see you. And we'll stop sharing the screen, please, Hannah, and we will move into our Q&A here in one moment. So I'll just let everyone get set up. Great, thank you all, and thanks again for such varied presentations. So just to begin, I'm conscious that we've had, I'm getting a note that the connection is very bad. Is that me? Could someone, one of the panelists, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great, thank you. Let's carry on. So one of the many questions have been coming through around concerns around connectivity when we're talking about these sort of digital solutions. I think we're all really conscious that in EiE settings we may not have the resources for technological solutions or the connectivity and electricity requirements. So that's definitely a question that's on people's mind that I think we'd like to start with. April, I'm conscious we didn't have time for you to share some of the sort of lower tech, no tech solutions around your teacher wellbeing work. So I wondered if you could jump in there.
Yes, I think one of the key things to stress is that we are just exploring this at the moment. So we don't have those solutions. What we want to do is figure out what are the key elements of that wellbeing methodology that the teachers find most important, and marry that with some information gathered from teachers in more remote areas who don't have access to data, to talk about how do they feel we can address this need with them, how can we connect with them, how often can we connect with them, and what ways do they feel would be most useful. Because I think at this moment, we don't have that information, or we don't in Waterhouse Holland. If anyone else has it, then that saves us a job. But I feel like what we wanted to do was start with the lower hanging fruit of using technology, but then also say, okay, well, how do we do this in a different way? And we don't have that answer at the moment. We're just trying to explore it.
Can I ask, why do we have to use technology? I mean, as Frost pointed out, because we have the same issues, Palestine refugees are not the richest, they're not the middle class of the region, because kids have their textbooks at this time. It's not a war, it's not about devastation and they lose. So children have their textbooks, and we know across the world children carry their textbooks backwards and forwards. So the idea of wraparound material, and wraparound literally means, you've got your textbook and you have your little bit which says, there's your textbook. Okay, we're going to do fractions today. Turn to page 10. What do you think? Why don't you cut up a piece of paper? Do page 10. Oh, did you manage to do page 10? Great, well done. I mean, we can do this, because this whole idea and the whole challenge we've had in UNRWA, it's not all about technology. I mean, when it can be, great. But, they're struggling even in the UK with this. So why aren't we thinking about how to help children use the actual textbooks which were designed for their study? Thank you. Sorry.
No, thank you, Caroline. And sorry, did someone want to jump in there?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in there just to say I completely agree, and it's one of the first things that we considered. Just most of the contexts War Child UK work in aren't highly digital, but one of the kind of the snags that we're still struggling with is we've been able to create learning packs that go around these resources that they already have or support with extra resources. But we aren't being able, or we haven't yet come up with a solution for connecting teachers in a non-digital way or supporting teachers directly in a non-digital way. And I'm really excited to hear if anyone has thought about this or has been able to come up with a solution or some ideas around this.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, great question. And I know I was on another call this week where people were discussing the use of radio as a means to connect the teachers. We've talked a lot about IRI for reaching learners, but how can we actually use that as a means for continuing teacher professional development and support? So yeah, if anyone on the line is exploring these kinds of modalities, please do reach out to us here at INEE. We would love to hear. I do just want to refer people, we did do a distance learning webinar a few weeks ago, which did stress this point about, you know, high tech, low tech and no tech solutions. And I think if you didn't have a chance to join, it might be helpful to listen to that webinar, and we're really keen to build on and develop on this work, as I say. I'd also just like to note that we have had a few questions today around inclusive education and around ECD. Those webinars are in our plan. So next week there will be an inclusive education webinar, which will speak to some of the questions you've raised directly. And similarly, we'll let you know the date for the ECD early childhood webinar very soon. So thanks for those questions. We've seen those and we will take those forward. Just to build on this point about low connectivity settings and really thinking about how we continue professional development for teachers at this time and support. Mary, I was just wondering if I could come to you. I'm conscious that the work you've done with Teachers for Teachers has really been a core part of it was about that type of support. And I just wondered if you could share some reflections and a bit more insight around that. And I'll share I know we have a great case study written up on that work, which I can share in the link as well, but perhaps just a few reflections from that work would be helpful as well.
Sure, thanks, Charlotte. So we had developed a project called Teachers for Teachers that was run out of Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. And the idea there, just to quickly summarize the initiative, was to make sure that it was robust, continuous professional development. So there was some face-to-face training. There were teacher learning circles where teachers helped each other in the interim, and to be able to extend support around not only what they were learning in the training room, but also around their own psychosocial well-being. And then we had a third component called mobile mentoring, where we did leverage, the use of technology, because teachers in that particular setting did have access to phones, or we were able to provide that access to phones. And through WhatsApp and WhatsApp messaging, we were able to send out, very short, obviously, kind of push and reminder messages about what they learned in the training room, what they were talking about in teacher learning circles, and also just things to remind them to take care of themselves. So layering in the psychosocial well-being for teachers. And I think what was helpful about that is that they were these kind of push messages, these reminder messages to give, teachers a moment to think about their own teaching practice or think about their own well-being. But I think some of you had mentioned that today. Another, I think, added benefit of that was that they were in a group together. So it wasn't just us providing curriculum and providing support. It was teachers who are really the experts of their own setting, talking to each other and sharing advice with each other and providing support. And I think they were able to do that, again, on multiple levels, around the curriculum and around particular strategies for teaching tricky concepts to students, all the way to different types of protection issues that were coming up for their learners, and then again, psychosocial well-being for the teachers themselves. So we're still relying on technology in that particular example, so that won't be relevant for all settings. But I think there are ways to emulate that connectivity, even in rural, distant areas. If teachers can socially distance in a safe way, talk to each other, connect with each other. If there are even simple cell phones, mobile phones, where some basic SMS messages could go out. I think there are ways to still, find ways to connect and to help people think about professional development and psychosocial well-being. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Mary. And we do have a great case study that I'll post in the chat that so people can find out more about that work as well. And just related to that, Dean mentioned at the start of the call that here at INEE we have a very active group known as the TIC, the Teachers in Crisis Context Collaborative, who are really sort of dedicated to these issues teachers are facing in EiE settings. And somebody on the chat did mention that that group has produced a lot of interagency tools and resources, training packs and coaching packs and competency framework, and there was a question about any discussion to support any of that work for the new context in which we find ourselves. To note that Mary mentioned the mobile mentoring work, and that curriculum is actually designed in line with the TIC materials, so perhaps that's also something we can look at on the INEE side, is making that available on the website. It has the messages and the nudges that can be sent via WhatsApp. But we're now joined by the conveners of that interagency group, Chris and Amy, and I just wondered if either of you wanted just to share any reflections or discussions on the TIC side about any interagency collaboration to support these efforts, as that question has come up a few times.
Yeah, sure. I can say something. Hi, everybody, and then maybe Chris, you can say as well. I think, you know, as with everybody, we've been sort of trying to figure out what's happening. I think it's been quite a struggle to figure out the best way to proceed. We are sort of looking at what the materials we have, and there's been a couple of examples of trying to pull these together pre-COVID to make them available sort of digitally. So we are looking at that potentially to be able to see how that could be interagency as well. And again, sort of looking at the teach wellbeing side of things as well, working with another INEE collaborative to look at how teach wellbeing can be really front and foremost in this response as well. And that's hoping that might progress in the next few weeks. We are sort of convening a group meeting next week, and so it's a chance for us to all sort of get together a little bit now that people are starting to settle into sort of their routines a bit more and figure out how we can adapt what we have already. There's a lot of existing materials in the peer coaching pack and in the TIC training pack that sort of speak very much to the CPD side of things that Mary was talking to, and to that peer support. So I think there's certainly something that we can discuss to do, but we sort of in that process of planning that now, I would say. Chris, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Thanks, Amy, and hi everyone. I think the only thing I'd add is also late last year the TIC worked on a compendium of case studies called Promising Practices in Teacher Management, Professional Development and Wellbeing. And obviously that was very much pre-COVID-19, but given how much the priority of teacher wellbeing has emerged in this conversation, there is a section in that publication focused on teacher wellbeing. So I think it provides some great context and excellent prompts in terms of what we mean by teacher wellbeing. And I think it's a challenge to us all to actually sort of reconceptualize how we work that in this COVID and social distancing era. So I'm just putting in the chat box now a link to that document. But yeah, it'd be great if you could check it out. I think it'd be really helpful. Yeah, thanks, Amy, and thanks, Charlotte.
Oh, you're on mute, Charlotte.
Thanks, Amy. Just saying, a commitment from us, I think, that we will keep trying to collect these examples and share them as widely as we can. And we'll make sure we include all of the links after the webinar. So thanks all. I think another question that has come up a lot has been considering a sort of a post-COVID era, if we can imagine that at the moment, and thinking about how we're supporting teachers now for that anticipated return, I think is on people's mind, particularly the potential significant need there will be around potential accelerated education and remedial education, and efforts to ensure that children are able to return to school. And so Charlotte at UNHRWA, I wondered if we could come back to you, as I know you touched on that, and I know UNHRWA are obviously very much involved with the Accelerated Education Working Group, and I just wondered if you could share a few more reflections on how we can be supporting teachers now as we think about that transition phase in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. Actually, I think, or at least for UNHRWA, it's really the beginning of the response. And even if we have planned to provide support during the back to school phase, it's not very clear right now how we're going to proceed with that. But as you rightly said, we'll need to provide teachers with training in accelerated education, in catch-up classes. And I think a very important point is that we know that when classes will resume, children will come back to school with very different level of exposure of learning content while the schools were closed. So basically what we are trying to do, at least I'm talking for West and Central Africa because I'm part of the response coordination in the region, what we are trying to do now is when we are supporting Ministry of Education in setting up a distance education program, we are also trying to include right now accelerated education and catch-up classes component for when the school will resume. So we are trying to plan to make sure that when children will be able to return to school, when teachers will be able to return to school, they also already, Ministry of Education will already have a plan to support this teacher in providing additional support to students who have missed a large amount of schooling.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. I realise these are big questions for us all to be grappling with at the moment. So it's really great to hear these reflections and these thoughts.
Yes, and maybe just, sorry,
please.
Charlotte, just to complete and mention that, as you rightly mentioned, so UNRWA is the part of the Accelerated Education Working Group, and the new guidance and toolkit of the Accelerated Education Working Group has just been released. So it's also a tool that can be widely shared and widely used while organizations are trying to implement accelerated education programs. Thanks,
Charlotte. We've had a few questions around how we're monitoring this work, and Frost and Caroline, I'm conscious that you mentioned that, but because we were running out of time, you didn't get a chance to expand on that. And I just wondered if you could share a bit more about how you are getting feedback from teachers during this time.
Thanks. Thank you. Basically, we are using every means to get, we find that the school principal has the contact and the communication with their teachers. So they are communicating with their teachers with regard to communicating with the children, and this can be through WhatsApp, it can be, through SMSs, and we are actually, one of the things we have been doing from the funding we've been raising is trying to buy bundles, and support connectivity for mobile phones, etc. So that's how they're doing it, is they're following up, they're seeing how many children. We were trying to ask core questions because we're a bit worried that when one field says, 60% of the children are involved, and another field says 70%, there's no comparability. So it's getting the core questions in terms of what we're looking at and what we're measuring in terms of the children's engagement, how long they're engaged for, etc., what the access issues are in their house, because it's not just the question, as I said earlier, of having the device, it's having the access to the device, having the interest. Interestingly, we found that boys had less interest, less interest in studying is not surprising, but less interest in actually going online, etc., than the girls. So we're having these core questions with regard to finding out how the children are doing, and then the school principal himself communicates with the teachers with regard to their work and how much they're doing, etc. And this is all part of the trying to kind of get these key answers to feed into it. And I just want to come back to, when we go back again, what we're saying to our 5 fields we just met today is, hang on, we've just been spending a lot of time on this distance learning approach. We've got a lot of good materials, whether it's wraparound and this, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're going to have another crisis more than likely anyway, but why don't we continue to see how we can use this approach, whether it's for accelerated learning, whether it's for the catch up, whatever we call it, when we go back, because we've got something here and we need to make it stronger. And also then the teachers themselves can follow up with the children the next day, and ask them about the self-study. In that way, we'll improve the self-study because we'll get that direct feedback from the children. So I think that we do need to know some key things, and we can find them out by, asking these questions and using the lower tech to get the answers from. But we also then need to feed it into our program and think about this program as we go forward, not only in terms of catch-up, but in terms of quality education, because there's a lot that we can do. We want our children to be autonomous learners. Most of the systems all of us are working with do not encourage autonomous learning. This is a chance to kind of really try to strengthen, to try to get teachers to think about open questions that they don't ask in the classroom. So I think this is a huge opportunity to go forward, in terms of catch up and in terms of, reshaping schooling a little bit, because sometimes it takes a crisis to make you really think about these things. So that's what we're talking about in UNRWA. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Yeah, and I think that speaks to a point a couple of us have made today around the lessons we can be learning and the hopefully finding the positives in all of this as we move forward. So yeah, thank you so much for that powerful reminder. I am very conscious of time, and Dennis, I'm conscious we had a few questions about the survey. Just to say, as soon as the survey results are ready to share, we'll make sure those are distributed via the INEE website. But Dennis, I just wondered if we could bring you in here, maybe just to share a little bit more about the methodology behind the survey, but then also some questions we're getting about influencing of national governments at this time. And I'm conscious, you know, we've heard some great example of things that have been done perhaps by NGO partners, and perhaps we can build on those in some of our influencing efforts. So can I just ask you for a bit more about the methodology, and then Education International's influencing efforts at the national level? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Maybe you can activate my video because it says it has been stopped by the host. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you well, Dennis. Please carry on and we'll try and fix that.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, in terms of methodology, we basically had a survey, a questionnaire with structured and semi-structured questions. So we had open-ended questions. So basically we targeted our affiliates, the 400 member organizations of EI, and I indicated earlier that 103 of them responded, representing 50% of the individual members, that is teachers and education support professionals, which is quite significant for us. In terms of influencing at national level, indeed, I mean, I talked about the need to talk to teachers, listen to them, listen to the education support personnel or staff. So we can only do this through institutionalized social dialogue, meaning there should be legislation protecting that dialogue between education unions and governments. And that dialogue must include actually dialogue about COVID-19, about an appropriate, effective, coordinated response, but also about what to do in terms of opening schools. There was a comment earlier on about accelerated learning. Yes, it should also include a conversation about how to do it right. Let's not make the mistake of imposing things on teachers and saying, oh yeah, children lost out, so you must do 1, 2, 3. Let's work out those solutions with them. If you may allow me to comment also on the question on preschool teachers. Yes, preschool teachers, disabled teachers, among the other categories that I mentioned earlier, are disproportionately affected for obvious reasons. Most of private most of the provision in early childhood education is private. And unfortunately, as a consequence of that, it turns out from the survey that preschool teachers or early childhood educators are disproportionately affected. And this is also a gender issue. Don't forget that over 90% of early childhood educators are women. So we're talking about the vast majority of people who are being affected in that sector being women, which is an injustice that should be corrected. And finally, just a comment on what do we do in situations where there is no technology. That's an important question. In fact, there are examples of radio programs, yes, TV programs, homework, assignment packages, etc., but they're not effective. And this proves what we've been saying all along, that technology is only a tool to support a teacher, but not to replace the teacher. And we've been telling people schooling is important. Nobody can replace that institution where students come together in a safe and healthy environment through online learning. You can't replace that. So we hope that people are learning from this experience and then will emerge better and strengthen our education systems. Thanks.
Thanks, Dennis. And again, just such powerful reflections. I think that listening to teachers and really advocating for them in terms of the support now, but also in the future. Leila, I'm conscious I'd just love to bring you in quickly for any final thoughts from the UNESCO Teacher Task Force side. I know you're doing a lot of work at the moment, but just any final reflections from you in the last minute.
Thanks a lot, Charlotte, and thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to speak and present the call for action and everything. I think it's just reinforced for us the importance of the advocacy and to keep making those links, especially reaching out to policymakers to make to ensure that, you know, these messages are getting across. And as you say, that we kind of build on this positive momentum that there is about teachers at the moment, and that's certainly our goal. I would maybe just also draw your attention to a little some data that we released yesterday, which just also reinforces the point about connectivity, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So we find that basically 4 out of 5 students are in households without any internet, even more than that. So yeah, same amount for computers as well in the household. So I think that it's calming and sobering in relation to some of these big discussions happening about, you know, distance education and ICTs. I think that it really brings it down to the level of low tech and no tech and how important that is. So yeah, so thanks. I think I'll leave it there because I know we don't have much more time. So thanks a lot, and yeah, we're happy to keep working with everyone. And thanks for all of your great work. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Leila, and excited to keep the conversation going with colleagues at the Task Force on Education International, particularly as we think around this sort of influencing work we can be doing together. Everyone, there are so many questions. We could have gone in so many directions in the Q&A. I'm sorry we don't have more time. We will put together an FAQ document to follow up on some of these points. And just to reiterate that commitment, we do have this interagency group working on support to teachers in crisis context. We'll have a call next week to follow up with some of the ideas here, and we'll definitely do our best to sort of collate these good examples and to share any tools and resources with you via the INEE website and via our different channels. So more on that soon. Please do look out for that. We'd love to hear about your work. Just a reminder that we do have a webinar next week focusing on inclusive education. That came up in several questions today. We will make sure that support to teachers in delivering inclusive approaches will feature on that webinar. So for those of you who raised those questions, please do look out for that. But excuse me, I'm conscious we're 1 minute over time. I just want to say a huge thanks to the panelists for sharing such powerful insight and examples. Thank you to our participants. I know these are very complicated times and everyone is working tirelessly to continue to provide education. So we're grateful to you for joining us today, and we hope to continue working together in these uncertain times. So thank everyone. We'll hopefully see you on the webinar next week. Best wishes.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks, Tony.